So I would like to introduce Kitty. She is from Six Nations of the Grand River. She is a mom, grandma, auntie, gardener, teacher, cook, and always a feeder of people. As a community food animator at Six Nations Health Services on Six Nations, Kitty teaches and promotes planting, growing, preserving, seed saving, eating fresh local food. With a master's in social justice and community engagement, Kitty is making change in the world by growing food and sharing ways to become sustainable and sovereign in our food systems, always encouraging people to claim or reclaim their connection to our traditional foods. She encourages relationships to self, each other, community, our foodways, and strives to share knowledge wherever she is.
I only chose 4 topics that I shared with Crystal that I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to share a little bit first about what my job is as the community food animator. And what my job literally is to anything that's connected to food, I'm a part of within the organization. And just so you know, and I'm sure some of you may even realize that food is connected to everything. There isn't one component of our lives that isn't connected in some way with food. So the first thing that I was going to talk to you about today is getting your garden started. And we have, unfortunately, in the way of the world right now, there's always discussion about it. People used to say it didn't exist, but climate change is a real thing. We used to say global warming, but in some places it's colder, so it's not really global warming, even though that is one of the components of it. With climate change, strange things happen. So we had some beautiful days. Folks got out there, uncovered their garden, raked up the leaves, got it all ready, and then we had snow for 2 days. So I'm always telling people, please, 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 right now, what I want you to be doing in your garden is picking up the big things, taking the big things out of it. I'm just going to run through how to get your garden set up if you have a garden now. If someone does not have a garden and wants to know how to start a garden, I will add that in. So you just go out right now, you take a look at your garden, and if your garden is like mine, because I am a firm believer, and you need to know this, I'm a firm believer, the uglier your garden is, the more you will get from it. People that make sure there's not a single weed and everything is raked perfectly and there's no extra brown leaves anywhere. If that's what you're striving for, well, good luck, first of all. But second of all, there is a component of a garden that it wants to be natural. So the uglier and messier things are around your plants, the better. And I don't mean, go out there and throw your Timmy's cup underneath your tomato plant, but you do want to put things down on the ground. So when you're going out in your garden now to get it ready, pick up the big things, like if sticks have blown in there, if you have stakes from last year, if there's little pieces of fence, any of that kind of thing is what you're going to take out. Anything else that landed there, for example, leaves, maybe you've pulled some weeds in other places that don't have seeds on them, you can just rip those into pieces as well. Stir those into your garden. The only time you put other plants into your garden besides what you want to grow is when you make sure there's no seeds. I generally will pull weeds out in the spring and shred them up because they don't have seeds yet. They're just starting their process. So there won't be any seeds. But those plants that are coming up in the spring are so full of food for your ground. So you want to rip them up or cut them up, whatever is your preference, and just stir them into your garden. It's the same thing with your coffee grounds, your veggie scraps, fruit scraps, eggshells, all of those things. So right away, I have a couple of friends that they garden, and every time I talk to them about this, they're like, do you know how ugly that's going to look? Coffee grounds in my garden, eggshells in my garden. Their gardens are pristine. But every single year, when we compare how much we've grown and what we've harvested, I invariably have the bigger harvest, because there's reasons for all of that to go down. And I only allowed like 15 minutes for this portion of the topic of the talk. So I'm gonna try and condense it even a little bit more. So Right now, literally all you're doing in your garden is getting it all stirred up and semi smoothed out. And probably within, I'm just going to tell you that I've done peas already. Your Swiss chards seeds can go in now. They're lovers of the cold, so they don't mind if they go in now. But no plants. There's too much cold still in the night to put those in. The best way to test to see if your ground is warm enough to put plants in the ground is to dig a hole that's like, 6 or 8 inches deep, just about, not very big enough for your fist to go into. And then you put your fist in there, push the soil around it. And if you start to feel cold right away on your hand when it's in that hole, it's too cold for your plants. So if you've started plants in your house or you're purchase plants or intend to purchase plants, that's how you're going to test and see if your soil is warm enough for them to go in, because those little roots are used to being in a pot that's nice and warm, even if they're sitting outside, because they've made their home in there, and those roots are happy to be in that little pot. And we'll talk in a minute about taking them out of there and putting them in the ground and the best ways to do that. But like I said, your peas, your Swiss chard, spinach can go in now. I will put Brussels sprout seeds can go in. And you hear me saying seeds, right? I'm not one to tell people to put plants in. We've become a society or a world, literally a world of instant gratification. I can remember as a small child, we would know that the garden was done and there was just the work to come when there was a whole bunch of sticks everywhere and strings marking where the rows were. I done the whole thing about putting in plants. That's relatively new. To be honest with you, that came about when they started having grocery stores, which was in the 40s. So up until the late 40s, we didn't have grocery stores. Everything you ate, or needed for your kitchen, spices, plants, vegetables, fruits, all that you traded for or grew yourself. You had chickens for eggs, you had cows for milk, you had cows for meat, you hunted for turkeys, or all of that stuff was done as being self-sufficient, more independent, so to speak. It wasn't until they came up with canning process of putting things into tin cans and creating grocery stores to sell those things that it became unpopular to have a garden. So technically, before the late 40s, if you had a garden, you were relatively well off. You had enough space, ground to grow everything you needed. You didn't have to work for someone else to get it or trade things, other things you did. Although lots of trading went on between folks that sowed or hunted or with people that grew things. And that's how it was done. And I can progress back, and that's probably another whole talk where I talk about how self-sufficient we were as Indigenous people, because we grew enough for ourselves, but we also grew enough, and you're going to really love this, we grew enough also for the community next to us. So our whole community would grow enough for us and another community, just in case that community had misfortune. So then we would be able to also help them to have enough to eat. But back to the grocery store. So once grocery stores started, it became to the point where you only had a garden if you were poor. It was a symbol of wealth to have your house full of these tin cans and this horrible salty food. I shouldn't say that. There are some factories that do a good job. but as a general rule, I'm just going to say it's much better to have fresh than it is to have canned. So then you were poor. It indicated poverty if you had a garden. And that went on for a long time, actually. And then probably it went right up until, I'm going to say in the mid 80s. early 80s maybe, people started to realize, you know what, the food from the store is not that great. There's a lot of salt in it. There's a lot of sugar in it. The processes, just imagine eating peas from the garden, yum, and a can of peas. That's the clearest example I give to people, because you can really tell the difference between a nice fresh pea and peas from a can. So it was in the 80s when people started going, you know what, maybe I'm going to grow a garden. Well, it became a symbol of wealth then to have a garden, because only if you could afford enough land to have a garden space were you going to grow your own food. Otherwise, you had to eat the crap dinner and canned food from the store. And I say crap dinner because that's what my granddaughter calls it. And she has since she was really little. Craft dinner doesn't come into her realm. It's crap dinner. And I'm always so pleased. Alana, she calls it crap dinner. But so then just the wealthy had garden spaces. They grew their own food, and it became a symbol of affluence to have your garden. It's simple to have a garden. You don't have to have a lot of space. I helped about 45 people in one spring over the course of a week and a half. I helped them put a garden on their porch. We went around to stores, et cetera, et cetera. We got 5-gallon pails. We put bunches of newspaper at the bottom, put some leaves and gunk in there, vegetable scraps. Then we put soil on top, because you only need a little bit of soil to grow a garden. If you are one of the lucky folks who have a really lovely garden right now, and you're just getting it cleaned up and ready to go, I'm so happy for you. If you are just one of those folks sitting there going, you know what, I'm going to do a garden this year. I'm doing it. I'm really doing it. And you have no idea what to do, and all you have is a yard with grass. I'm going to tell you right now how to put your garden in. It'll take me less than 5 minutes. It'll take you about an hour, and you will grow a garden. And I'm sorry, folks that already have an established garden, but this new garden will grow a better yield than an established garden. The very first year of doing this type of garden, you get the best yield ever. So what you do is you choose your space, you mark it out, and you determine how big you're going to make it. When people are starting a new garden, I'm always really clear with them. Never go bigger than 10 by 10 if it's your very first garden ever, because you will overwhelm yourself. It'll get ahead of you. It'll be covered in weeds. Your plants won't thrive. You'll be unhappy, and then you'll quit. And then I'll have to come and find you and cheer you all back up and get you going again. We'll have to start all over. So start with a 10 by 10 if it's new. So 10 by 10. So just, splurge on grabbing a few extra of those free papers that are in the stores. And you lay those down in layers of 4 or 5 sheets of paper, overlap them so there's no grass to be seen. This is if you're doing it over top of grass. And you cover it completely. It can even be on bare soil, but on grass in particular. You cover it with those newspapers. You throw a bunch of leaves over it, give you a little hint. People look at you weird, but if you don't have trees in your yard or near you to get leaves, go to the park, because you can take a garbage bag. They have no problem with you picking up leaves, crunchy, dead leaves. They look at you funny, but that's okay. Funny looks are fine as long as you're going to get food from it. Dump those on there, spread them out. Every time you peel a vegetable or a fruit, or you have something that of the vegetable or fruit variety, eggshells or coffee grounds, put those on top of there too. Grass clippings if you cut your grass, and then a bit of compost if you choose to. You don't have to. I generally tell people they don't have to the first year. And then you cover that with just 2 or 3 inches of soil. 2 or 3 inches, that's not very much. The first year you won't be able to grow potatoes or turnips, anything that takes a lot more depth, but you can grow everything else. So there's your garden. It's a lasagna garden. You can do those layers over and over again. To begin with, it'll be a bit up above the ground, but by next year, it will be level with the ground. You'll add more leaves in the fall. You'll add more compost in the fall. And if you choose to, you can add soil, but you won't need to. I'll tell you that right now. It's not expensive to get a garden started. You don't need to get a tiller in there. You don't need to spend hours and hours digging. Cover the ground. You're literally saving yourself from weeding. Cover the ground, put your layers of browns and greens. You're literally creating a compost pile that you're going to cover with soil. And then you put your seeds in. And because you have so much underneath that soil feeding that ground, you get the best garden that you've ever seen. It'll be your first one. You'll be so proud, and it will just get you started and keep you going in the gardening biz with all of us. So that's called a lasagna garden. You can certainly look that up. There's more great in-depth articles written about it now, but I started doing that years and years ago. My children were little. Actually, I think I carried my daughter around in a backpack on the front of me when I figured out that was the easier way to do it. I started a community garden down in the States, and that's what I encouraged people to do. So no digging required, no tilling, none of that has to be done. You create that lasagna garden, you plant in it, you grow in it. There's a few things that happen. The grass won't grow through as much. It might grow here and there, but if you've got your layers nice, if it's a bit windy on the day you do it, wet that newspaper when you put it down, and then put your other things on. You might spend a week or so ahead of time gathering your supplies, so you could do it all at once, or you can do a bit at a time. Newspaper and then leaves and wet it down. And then a couple days later, come out, throw the other stuff on and the other stuff, and so on until you've got it done. I had someone do a lasagna garden. They did that in layers. They ended up having it about a foot above their yard because they were concerned it wasn't going to be deep enough. But their yield wasn't any better than someone that put in just the single layers of things. So that's a lasagna garden. That's the easiest way to start a garden. You get a really nice harvest from that. It's, like I said, not so good for root vegetables, but you can grow everything else in that. That's the simplest garden that there is to get started. And I'm just going to say this. I have not yet ever, in all the years that I've recommended this type of garden, have I ever had someone not be successful. It's always been successful. It's literally a 100% success rate with that type of garden. So does anyone have any questions?
I have a question. What about hay bales garden? What's your thoughts on that one?
Okay, so straw, right? You mean straw?
Yeah.
Yeah, so straw. It took me a long time to teach a few folks because hay is what the horses eat. Straw is the one that's literally the leftovers when they harvest wheat. I grew potatoes, my whole potato patch in a row of straw bales. All I did was wet them down, split the bale open, drop the potato in there. The potatoes grew out of the top of it. And I got an amazing harvest. Here's the nice thing about, even if you have one bale and you grow a couple plants in it, it's so easy to get your potatoes out. I also had a straw bale garden, and I grew just lettuce on top of one and radishes in the other. It only works for 1 year. And then that straw has broken down enough that you can add it to your lasagna garden. If you have it, if you're gardening in pails, then you can stuff that straw in the bottom of those pails the second year. But yeah, I would have never ever thought that it would work, but I got a fabulous harvest of red potatoes out of I think I did like 12. I never do things in small amounts. It was like, let's try a straw bale. Okay, I'll get 12. Let's do 12. So we did 12 and we got lots of potatoes. So yeah, that's have you ever seen that process done? I know beets grow really well in there. I saw someone make a pyramid out of them. and they planted strawberries in them. The difficulty was the second year they had to feed them. And it's not really a difficulty. It's just something to keep in mind, because eventually that straw will break down, because it's a nice thing to add into your lasagna garden as well. Eventually they'll start breaking down. Just know that when it does, it starts collapsing down on itself. So it's better not to build them up too high. Stick with a one level. Is there anything in particular you wanted to grow in this straw?
Nothing. I just seen that people were doing their whole gardens in straw, and I'm like, that's what I was worried about, the breakdown after.
Yeah, so. I've found that it only worked one really well the first year. The next year I had to get new straw bales because it does break down. It's nice because it feeds the ground when it breaks down. You just take the strings off and spread it out. That's why I like to use it when I cover my garlic, because I don't take it out. I leave it in there so it can be fed into the ground, because it breaks down relatively quickly. So, but it is a nice medium to grow in if you want to have something that's a little bit raised up.
From the potatoes I was looking for.
Oh, potatoes. Yeah, that's the one I did. It was great. Yeah. You have to remember they need to be watered every day. That's the only drawback to planting in straw, is they have to be watered every day, because the water just, of course, just runs right through them. And there's not a lot, there's no capacity for the straw to hold water. So the potato plants get a drink when it comes, and then that's their drink until the next day when you give them another drink.
How do you keep critters from getting at your lasagna garden?
Well, this is a good question, because I'll give you some tips on keeping critters out of your garden completely. So critters, as a general rule, because it's gonna be in layers and it's gonna be wet, you're talking about the food scraps, I'm presuming. They don't generally come for them because they're breaking down, and like people, critters prefer things that have not so much a spoiled taste, which surprised me. I didn't realize that. Well, it's probably been 20 years ago now, but I was talking to someone. I thought they dug in the garbage because they liked rotted food. They dig in the garbage because there's nothing else. So my answer to that has always been to have a separate tiny space that I create for the animals, that they grow accustomed to it being there. For rabbits in particular, I'll put like lettuce leaves, carrot scraps, even the odd carrot, apples they like as well. I will put that away from my garden with a fence in front of it, like they're keeping me out of their garden, and I have no problem with it. Where we live, it's nothing to drive in the laneway and see like a dozen rabbits hopping around the yard, but I have 4 gardens. I don't have difficulties with the rabbits taking in the garden because I've created a garden for them at the edge of the yard. So there's not a lot of, I've not had a lot of difficulty with them getting in a lasagna garden. It depends on how many critters you have. And at the end of the day, here's my answer to that always. Everybody's got to eat. Even that little squirrel or that little raccoon or that skunk, whatever it is, they need to eat. So if you don't want them digging in your garden, which I recommend you create a situation so they don't, there are ways to keep them out if they have started and you don't want them in there. Things like the edge of your garden, plant marigolds, because they stink, and most animals don't like sharp smells. I've encircled a garden that had tender plants in it, completely all the way around with smoky paprika and cayenne pepper. So they walk through it. They only do it one time. Nobody likes a hot foot, and that generally is what happens to them. If you're talking about things like snails or slugs, crushed up eggshells along the edge of your garden, they won't crawl over them because, I just imagine dragging your belly over top of eggshells. That's literally what they do. Is that what you were looking? Is that the answer? Is that what you were looking for? hopefully. I'm going to, because we've now created our garden, whether you can do the lasagna in a pail, you can do it on your lawn, you can do it in your garden space. And I recommend those layers as well, without the newspaper, or you can put it because it's still a carbon. They don't use arsenic ink anymore in newspapers. They're not allowed to. It's against the law. So using newspapers is fine as long as the paper isn't shiny. If you have lots of weeds and it's going to be really difficult, I recommend to people then to use cardboard as that bottom layer. It will take 2 or 3 years to break down. So you'll be that long before you can do root vegetables, but it's worth it. It saves you in the long run a lot of work. So now you've got your garden ready, and the next thing you want to do is get your plants in. Again, I'm going to say my recommendation, as always, is to put in seeds. But given the fact that we have climate change and erratic weather and things have changed, I recommend, even in our area where we have a really nice growing season, to have peppers and tomatoes and eggplants started ahead of time. Those are the only 3 that I actually recommend that you start. The rest can start from seed. Some people like to start their broccoli and cauliflower because they prefer to get them quick and fast so they can put something else in there. But those 3 I recommend if you're going to start a plant, and those would be the 3. There's been a lot of discussion about cucumber over the past 3-4 years. There's a blight that gets cucumbers. If you put your cucumbers in and you get that blight, if you keep picking the leaves off, as long as you leave a few, that's the best that you can do for that blight, because it's airborne. There's nothing we can do about it. The blight I'm talking about is the leaves yellow, then they get white, and then they shrivel up. You can't really get produce if you don't have the plant taking food in. So here's the answer to that. I put cucumbers in as seeds, and I put them in as plants. So there's always a continuous steady supply of the plants being in the garden. So in order to, we'll start first by transplanting. So you get your tomato, pepper, or eggplant, and they're all nightshades. So they're the best thing to do for them. The best thing to do for them is I'm sorry, there's someone at the door. The best thing to do for them is to dig the hole the same size as the pot that you've purchased them in, with the exception if you buy them in a pony pack. So a pony pack is when they're those little tiny squares. If you look at the bottom and there's roots hanging out the bottom, that's going to tell you right there that they're already struggling. Those roots are out and about looking for something else to eat. So the key to doing a good transplant is having a good size hole, but taking the plant out of the pot and tickling the roots. Tickle them till most of that soil falls off. I do a thing with kids where we go tap, 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 tickle, 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 tap, 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 tickle, 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 and then that soil falls away. When you do that, the plant and the roots go, whoa, someone just stole all our food. Everybody go looking for some more. So when you put them in the hole, they will immediately start searching around them. If you don't do that, you will, at the end of the season, your plant might have grown, but not to its capacity. It also will have a small harvest because it will just keep circling around in that tiny shape that pot was, because it didn't go looking. It in the beginning of its life said, this is the size of our house. Yeah, we don't really fit, but we'll do the best we can. So if you tickle and tap the roots and tell them, take away the food source they have and they have to go looking, they will automatically spread out into the ground around them. You'll get a bigger plant and a bigger harvest. That's the key component that I share when I talk about transplanting things. The other thing is I saw I've done this before, and everybody's like so careful. They're gently taking it out, trying to keep the soil just right. And I pull it out of the pot and I shake the plant and I tickle it and I tap it. And that in itself causes its adversity. It causes adversity to that plant. That plant goes, wait, I'm better than this. I'm tough. I can do it. And it will stand up to that. When you transplant tomatoes in particular, this is the one that you do to it. Once they've grown 6 inches beyond where they were when you got them, take a corn broom or some corn stalks and brush the top really hard, because that mimics a wind that's picking up the soil, and the tomato plant, excuse me. That mimics for the plant that everything is drying up, and they run the potential of getting knocked over, and they will thicken their stem. The stem of the plant will thicken. Sorry. So for tomatoes, that brushing of the top of them, that's what it tells that plant. Because here's the most important thing to know about every single plant. Just like us, they are alive. Just like us, they have a purpose. Just like us, they're connected to the land. Just like us, they seek connection. So it's difficult sometimes for people to grasp when I'm talking about plants being sentient or having a knowledge of themselves and their place in the world, but they do. Every single thing does. I've had great, huge discussions about it with scientists who say there's no head, so no brain, so no understanding. So then tell me, if that's the case, why, if we use the corn stalk on the top of that tomato plant, does it think that that's the wind blowing sand on it or dry soil? Does it thicken its stem? They say, well, that's a science thing. That stem will thicken on its own. No, okay. Been at this a while. First picture of me probably is me propped up in the garden before I can even sit up on my own. Many, many, many experiments. If you don't do that to the tomato plant, the stem does not enlarge. I've seen tomato plants that are as big around as 2 or 3 fingers before it's even grown, because I do that and I do it a couple times over the season. The other thing about tomatoes plants is they really only need 7 leaves to get tomatoes. And the less leaves it has to feed, the bigger the harvest of the tomatoes. So taking those in a tomato branch, there's a little V, and there's always a plant that comes out here. That will come out, it'll get leaves. Sometimes it'll even get flowers, but that sucker will never get tomatoes. So one of the things you should do at least 2 or 3 times a week is look for those and sucker those off. Take off any leaves that are starting to go by, because the plant will try and repair them. And you don't want it to spend its effort and energy on that. So same process for putting in almost every plant that you've started. Make the hole the size of the pot or a little bit bigger. Give the roots a tickle, put them in the ground. There's two schools of thought. Some people put water in the hole. Some people water the plant after it's in the hole. I've tried it both ways, had equal success both ways. So I say it's up to you. It's easier, however, if you put water in the hole. My caveat to that is, if you don't have good drainage, then put the water on the soil after it's in. The biggest issue we have in our area, in particular on Six Nations, is clay soil.
What about salt in the hole with the plant? Put salt in the hole, then the plant.
Yeah. So that is, for me, that's one of the old tales that they used to tell, because the salt took the place of sand or nutrients in the soil. It's not necessary unless you've tilled up the ground, because all of the things that we need as humans is in the top couple inches. Zinc, the potassium, the salts, all of that is in that top 2 inches. If all you do is cover it with paper, you're giving the plants access to that. Too much salt actually will kill your plant. If you watered it with salt water, it would be, and the mixture was wrong, your plant would yellow. And like everything in the world, I'm just going to say there's an exception to that. Tomatoes love Epsom salts. So magnesium in the Epsom salts mixed in, but it's only like a couple of tablespoons for a gallon of water. That will increase the plant's ability to flower. But it's also not necessary if you are putting all of those other things in your garden. We really don't need to feed the plants if we continue to feed the soil. That is a good question. And yes, salt at one point was used quite readily because they were tilling the soil or plowing it. And what happens is you take that top 2 inches when you till or plow, and you tip it down. If you tip it down further than 8 inches, it takes 85 years for all of those good things for you to come back to the top. So when you go to dig a hole and you're going to put a plant in there, make sure you're putting that top couple inches back into that, where that plant is, because that's where all of those things are, the salts and the magnesiums and zincs and coppers and et cetera, all of those good for you minerals. Good for you and good for the plants. That's where they are. But yeah, I have that is a discussion of things that went on before.
I've heard that Epsom salts make tomatoes sweeter. Is that true?
It'll draw if it is a sharp tomato. I'm sorry, they're dumping gravel next to me here outside. If it is a sharp, there's tomatoes that are grown specific for the acid in them. Epsom salts will decrease that acid, but you can also grow that tomato without the Epsom salts and add a pinch or a teaspoon of maple syrup to it when you're cooking. So sugar, maple syrup, a bit of honey, that will tone that acid down, same thing. But yeah, it appears as if that Epsom salts increases the amount of sugar in the tomato. But what I think, and I got it, like I said, I got a friend who's a scientist, so I'll ask him. If I'm not mistaken, what was described to me is it reduces the acid. So the reduced acid therefore makes the tomato taste sweeter. So in essence, it does, yes.
They're wondering if there are any suggestions about sand, soil, and clay and success around veggies that would work best in swampy areas. It can be safer later as well if you'd like, but
that's a good question. And so think about the plant itself. If it's something that has a lot of water in it, peppers, tomatoes, they don't especially love their feet to be soaking wet, but they do like to have more water than most plants. Anything that grows down into the soil, a root vegetable of any kind, they don't mind if the ground is a little bit more wet. The difficulty there is if the soil is like almost too swampy, you're going to have lots of underground critters, and nothing better. They've got all day, they just eat their way through your root vegetables. So lots of greens. Is there another question? All I'm seeing is the chat logo.
No, that's a good that's some good insight there. And then also somebody else said they also have clay where they are. What grows best in clay? So that's my question as well, because I have a lot of clay in our soil.
Oh, perfect. Let's talk about what's grown clay. So there's a process to Yes. There's a process to amending clay soil. So here's the first thing. You need to know what the pH of it is. I'll tell you right now, if you have mostly clay in your soil, it's going to be 77.4, which is the ideal growing pH for plants, vegetables, almost all vegetables. The difficulty is clay is so fine, it's condensed. So the answer to that, clay is perfect for growing vegetables, but it's too condensed. It will quite often get into chunks if you go out in your garden too soon. Don't start tilling up until at least the second week of May if you have clay, because you need some of that moisture to be out of it, or you'll get chunks and they won't go away till the next year. The best recommendation that I have for you if you have clay soil is to have the ugliest garden ever. So in your clay garden, mix in leaves and small plants that are around the garden, grass clippings, straw, anything and everything that you can mix in so that you're creating space, because your plants, their roots have to be able to breathe and get a drink without drowning. The worst thing that happens, what happens in clay, it's not that the clay is too hard. That's what people think. But what happens is it holds the water around the roots. So the first time it gets a drink, the plant's like, oh, yum, a drink, yay. And then the next time the water comes in the ground, the clay hasn't let it leach away. It's like, oh, a drink. And then the next time it's like, and so it does its very best to survive while it's underwater. Even though it looks like it's dry, the clay holds a lot of moisture, and that plant, those roots, those little tiny roots that are in that ground are like doing their best to not drown while they're in there, and they're gurgling and burgling underneath there like you're holding their head under a mud puddle. So the best thing to do is amend that soil. Put some leaves, grass, clippings, small plants, coffee ground, anything that will create space. So what you're trying to do is make that clay not so condensed. It means that you will not have a pretty, smooth, beautiful garden that needs to be tilled every week. It means that you're not going to try and stir that down so far that it's away from, it's not protecting those roots. That amending of the soil, I've had people put peat moss in it, but if you put peat moss in, you have to include things like leaves, because the peat moss and the clay will make some really nice cement blocks you could build a house out of. So you can't just put those things in there. It's got to be a mixture of all of that stuff. So there's nothing worse than creating an adobe house where you want to grow a tomato. It just doesn't work. So there's more than enough stuff comes out of your house. As long as you're not putting meat or oil into your garden, if it's something that you had in the house for dinner, put it in there. And yeah, your garden will look ugly and people will go, is that a macaroni and a tomato thing in there? Hey, yeah. But it's aerating the ground and it's feeding the soil. So that is a super good question. And that's the number one question that I get when I'm talking to folks, especially in this area along the river, because everybody's garden has got clay in it. Do not be afraid to stir stuff in there. That's the only way that you're going to be able to aerate those roots and keep the water and air moving where the plants are growing. And I'm sorry, if you like a really pretty garden, then I'm going to suggest you build sides up above the ground, fill it full of very expensive soil, keep stirring everything. And I'm just going to tell you this, eventually, because of gravity, the earth pulls that soil back down to it. You can fill a 2-foot box full of soil, and within 2 or 3 years, it's gone down to 1 foot. And within, if it's left to its own devices, it'll go down to just inches, because Mother Nature, our Mother Earth, they abhor a space, a vacuum, any kind of emptiness. they fill it in. So as far as they're concerned, if you raise it up above the ground, there's a space between the ground and them. Gravity pulls it in so that it's all connected again. So stir in things. Stir in as many things as you can. If you find, if you get the opportunity to, don't do it too often. I don't recommend it more than once a season. And usually I tell people once every other season, put a little bit of ash in there as well. A little bit ash from a garden, from a wood stove or a fire pit, as long as you haven't, you know, thrown anything in it besides wood. There are many beautiful stories of creating a mound, but I will tell you right now, there's none as beautiful as this story that I'm about to tell you. So I was working at the community garden, and there was these old men that lived around the corner, 6, sometimes 8 of them. They'd come and park their butts at my picnic table in where I was working, and they'd sit there with their coffee cup in one hand and a smoke in the other, and they'd go, "What is she doing now?" And I would invite them to come and help me, and they'd be like, "No, I gotta go," and they'd leave. So I learned to not ask them to help me until they had been there for a while. This went on for a great number of weeks. And finally, it was time for me to start building my mounds. And I thought, I'm going to get these old fellas to help me. They would sit there and natter. And when I'd come close, they'd stop and they'd look at me and they'd, "What are you going to do now, girly?" I'm like, "Ooh, well, today is mound day. Today I'm going to put the mounds in." So I talked to them a little bit. I said, "This is what I know. This is what I was taught, and what I've learned is, in order to grow a mound that you can handle by yourself, you put one knee down on the ground and one up, one hand down on the ground and one up, and you reach. And where you can reach to is the very center of your mound. That's a mound that you can care for by yourself." So the one old guy, he's like, "You got a pretty long reach on you. That's a pretty big mound." I'm like, "Yeah, but you know what? I'm still gonna do it." So I said, I got to pack the grass down. I know that that's what I have to do. I have to pack the grass down before I start my mound. So I get out there and I'm stepping up and down, and they're mumbling. I can hear them. They're just muttering back there. A spokesperson comes over and he's like, "You want us to help you?" I'm like, "Yeah, if you would, that'd be great. This is stupid." I'm like, "Okay, but you offered." So these gentlemen stood up and they came and they pushed me out of the circle that I had created by walking in a circle around where the mound would go. And they lined up one behind the other, and they stepped, and they kept stepping, and they kept stepping, and they kept stepping, and they're grumbling and muttering. And then all of a sudden, and see, it's going to make me cry because it made me cry that day. All of a sudden, one of them started to sing, and he was singing. It was Mohawk. He was singing, and it was quiet, just him singing. We could hear the birds. And I don't know if you've ever been to the community garden on the reserve. It's a beautiful spot. It's very quiet. It's at the end of a dead end, and he's singing in this old, rough, gruff voice, this beautiful song. And I asked later what it was about. Actually, it was 3 weeks later before he finally came back. But he said he was talking about what it meant to be a strong warrior helping women so that everyone in the community could eat, so that everyone in the longhouse is what it would have been, but everyone could eat. And they marched around. They created 5 mounds for me that day, and they sang through every one of them. And they matted that ground down, and they put soil in the wheelbarrow, and they helped me build those mounds. The mounds weren't very deep. They were in the center themselves. They were about 1.5 feet high, and it sloped down. And they said to me, soak your corn, girly. We'll be back to plant it. So I took the corn and because I always do soak it. I soak it overnight because then you know which ones to put in the ground. They'll get tails. Within 24 hours, they'll start getting a tail, start to spread a root. So then I brought them back, and only 2 of them came back to plant, but that was okay. But that was the most beautiful thing that I had ever seen. These delightful old gentlemen marching in a circle, singing about being as important as they could ever have been in their life, right? So that's my most beautiful story of a mound, and I will, to the day I die, that's going to stick with me, that they did that for me. They still come back when I'm there occasionally. They'll wander by, they'll still park at the picnic table, and they'll smoke their cigarettes and they'll drink their Timmies and they'll grumble about what am I doing now. But the mounds are still at the garden because of those men. And we planted that corn because you plant the corn first. The corn goes in the ground, the older sister, and she comes up, and when she's about 6 or 7 inches high, then you put the baby sister in around her, and that's your beans. And it's always a climbing bean because the big sister's job, the oldest sister's job, is to hold the hand of that little sister, the bean, to hold her hand because she can only crawl along the ground. And if she, as the older sister holds her hand, it lifts her up. So you'll see her wrapping herself around her sister, and they'll grow together. Once you have the beans in the ground for 4 or 5 days, giving them that bit of head start, then around the edge at the bottom, I put in the middle sister, and that's our squash. And the middle sister has the best job, the biggest job, the most important job. And I often find that this is the case with middle children. They do the most protecting of everyone else. So they look out for the baby. They keep the critters away from the older sister so that she can do her job and grow our most precious commodity, the corn. But without one another, they don't do as well. And we've done experiment after experiment with it with children. We've proven it 1,000,000 times over that corn, beans, and squash grown in a mound together has a much bigger a harvest than you would get if you grew them in rows. So I'm talking about an individual mound that you would grow yourself, and you can do a few of them beside your garden, in your garden, however you want to do it. Here's the nice part about a mound. Once the corn is up, the beans are growing, the squash is up. Those squash plants will keep the weeds down. You won't have to weed that mound. Those leaves will stop the weeds from growing underneath it. They're prickly underneath. They'll stop critters from coming up and eating your beans and getting your corn. They'll protect the ground from the sun so that it stays moist longer. They'll hold the water, the moisture in for them all to be there. Now, everyone talks about corn requiring a lot of nitrogen, which is true, and the beans feeding them the nitrogen. That's only true after the second season. The beans pull the nitrogen the first season. They start putting it into ground that season. It will be available for use by the corn and the squash and themselves not until the following year. That's when it'll be there. It is very important when you take your mound apart. Excuse me. It's important that when you take it apart, that you break up those bean plants and put them back into that mound, because that's where a portion of the nitrogen comes from. Bean plants pull nitrogen from the air. They take it down to their roots, and then it's dispersed into the ground. That's why it takes a season for that to happen. So that's that's the mound planting in a nutshell. Some people soak their beans. I don't, depending, unless it's there's one bean called a Kentucky Wonder Climber those ones I do soak because the outside of them is quite thick. But my favorite to grow in a mound garden is scarlet runner beans. And that's because they're so beautiful. They get a big bean. They do a nice dried bean. That's my favorite to grow in a mound. Hopefully you can still hear me over all the ruckus outside. Does anyone have any questions about the mound planting itself?
I do.
Okay.
Is this, I soak the little corn niblets here for a day?
Yeah, so you take each little corn kernel grows one corn. And so in a mound, you would put like between 5 and 7 per mound on the top, depending on how wide your mound top is. And then 5 or 7 beans around. And then I generally don't do more than 5 squash plants, but you can do more if you have lots of space for it to spread out. But yeah, each kernel is one plant, and you don't want to put a whole bunch in there because they won't survive. It's too much in one space. So yeah, I generally only plant white corn in my mounds, but I have seen it where people have grown flint corn. I've seen them where they've grown it's a corn eat off the cob. It's a Seneca Chief. It's a bigger kerneled yellow corn. But people talk a lot about how things have been modified, and we modify them, and we did modify plants to be the best of the best. When you had that cob held up, Cody, when we harvest our corn and hang it in the longhouse, and I still do it in my home, it hangs up. And in the winter, when you're making corn mush, and if you're gonna roast some corn, or if you're gonna lye some corn, you use one end and one end. You leave that strip in the center all the way around. Those are the seeds you plant. Those are the kernels that you plant. The reason for that is they're the best of the best. They're the biggest of the kernels. They're the nicest of the kernels. They're generally the most filled in terms of what's inside them, so you'll get the best corn plant. We knew that. So, but technically doing that modified that corn. There is a picture that I saw one time of a corn cob that was about, I'm going to say like 22 inches long, because they kept on doing that season after season, growing their corn. I saw a couple chats pop up. Do you want me to answer those questions? Or no? Is there a chat?
Yeah, sure, Kitty.
Okay.
There was one that just asked about how many corn plants per mound.
Yeah, so between 5 and 7
said,
on a small mound.
Yeah.
I think that was also like varieties of corn.
And then the next one was how far apart?
Okay, I have a really good story to tell you. Here's what you do. You put your white corn in the ground in one corner of your garden. You take say you're going to grow flint corn or yellow corn as the other one. You put those seeds into a bag. You put that bag by your pillow. You go to bed and you sleep and wake up just as the sun gets up. When the sun gets up, you grab that bag of corn and you start walking away from your garden. And you walk and you walk and you walk until just before the sun sets. And that's where you plant that corn so they don't cross. The only other way to do it is to plant them staggered and to bag the corn, because every corn will cross. That's our biggest issue right now, maintaining our traditional white corn, is it's crossing with corn that's growing in the fields. So what I suggest is you start your white corn, you get it growing so that it's going to you're looking for a window of like 10 to 14 days in between them pollinating. So you can also do things like, if you plant corn, plant sunflowers between them, a tight double row of sunflowers, because that will also stop them from cross-pollinating. But if you're going to grow two kinds of corn in your garden, just know that you might as well eat it all, because you won't be able to grow it. If it's cross-pollinated, 9 times out of 10, it won't grow the next year. So yeah, I can answer more in depth about how to bag. Like, you bag the boy. The top of the plant is the boy. The silks are essentially the girl. That's what they pollinate. Every silk, you know how you have to pick those off when you're going to have corn roast? Every one of those silks attaches to a kernel. So however many kernels on a cob, that's how many silks were on the end of that corn cob, because every kernel has its own silk. So yeah, I saw the chat thing again. I think there's another question. I wish I could see them.
Yes, this one says, somebody asked, how close can a mound be to another?
Oh, you just want to have enough space to walk between them. And bear in mind, if you're growing different kinds of squash, you'll need space between them. You won't want them, because you can grow squash, winter squashes together. You can grow summer squashes together. But if you grow a summer squash and a winter squash together, they'll cross-pollinate. And there's no sense saving those seeds, because you won't get a true plant the next year. You might think you're planting a winter Hubbard squash, and it might come up as a delicata, depending on what it was close to. They're quite attracted to one another. Like, hey, y'all want to come over here, talk to me, cross-pollinate with me? They'll invite one another over. Peppers are like that. Tomatoes are like that. Interestingly enough, green and yellow beans won't cross-pollinate. They can be planted side by side and they won't cross-pollinate. So
There's one everyone's question. Where can you buy white corn for planting?
Okay, I have white corn seeds and I give it away. As a general rule, you won't find it for sale anywhere. If you are interested in getting some, get your address to Crystal or Cody or Kathleen, and I'll package some up and mail it to you. If anyone is interested in corn seeds, I harvested a lot of corn last year, and I just took all of the centers off of the cobs so that I would know how much corn I have to hand out. And I had about 3 bushels. I'm down to about just a little over a bushel. There's just a bit left in the other ones, so I still have some. Or bear in mind, every kernel grows a plant. If you ask me for a bushel full, I'm probably going to say no, because that bushel full I give out. Okay.
Somebody said, I know there are a few seed swap groups on Facebook. They have become more popular due to seed sovereignty. So that's a comment from Chesney. Be aware of that, everyone. And then Eileen asked, can flint corn go bad?
It can mold, because flint corn, for some reason, holds more moisture. You have to make sure it's dried really well. I'll tell you this, I normally dry my flint corn. I'll take one cob, I'll take the kernels off each end, I'll put it in a jar, and I'll watch it closely for a few days. This is probably early winter, to make sure that it's dry enough so that it doesn't mold, because it will get mold before white corn will. For some reason, white corn is more airtight, more easily holds itself and lets go of its moisture. But flint corn has a tendency to hold on to moisture. That's why it will more often than not get, and it's a furry mold. I'm just going to say probably a long, long time ago, we'd have just shook them, washed them, and cooked them anyway. But, no sense taking any chances the way the world is now.
Mm-hmm.
You could try trying to sprout them, see if they'll sprout, start them in pots, see if they'll grow. That's one thing that could be done. Some molds will stop plants from growing, but sometimes it's just from moisture sitting on the shell of the plant, or the shell of the One of the things I didn't get a chance to address was how to feed your garden. And I'm just going to say this now. My recommendation is always to make a manure tea. So you find someone that's got generally horses, because I prefer horse poop because it's not as stinky. You put it in a 5-gallon pail, you stir it, so you got to stir it for about half an hour, and then you let it settle and you strain that off. The other way to feed your plants, which is like an ongoing thing, is remember the beginning of the conversation where I said, put all your scraps in your garden, make your garden ugly, put grass clippings in there, put torn up weeds in there, bury them in the ground, let them start breaking down. That's a really good way to feed your plants. I never ever recommend people to purchase a feed of any kind because we don't know what's in it. You don't know what's been put in it. So make your own compost tea to feed your plants, or feed the soil, because that feeds the plants. If you do permaculture, or I love that they call it permaculture, it was really what we did. What happened is, as we were weeding the tools, and I've made one. I took a scapula from a deer and I made myself a hoe with a stick from the bush. Oh man, that thing's amazing. I did one from a deer and one from a moose. So I have one that's about that big from the deer and one like that from the moose. But that's what I do, is I hack those weeds up and I stir them into the ground, and that continues to feed the ground as they break down. That's your best way to feed your plants. Mm-hmm. My very first thing is always greens. So it doesn't matter, as long as you have a window, you can grow them in soup cans for all that. Is they put some soil in them. If you don't have access to soil, again, if you're walking through the park and you scoop up a can of soil, no one's going to pay much attention to you. It's a nice way to get some little planters going every day. Go for a walk and take out your pet can and fill it up and put it in the window. I just get, I always recommend to people to do greens. And by greens, I don't always mean lettuce. I mean like spinach, Swiss chard will grow fine in a can. Those are the easiest ones to grow in the window. Herbs are another nice, easy one. They prefer to be indoors because they're spoiled, rotten babies. We've pampered them to no end. Basil loves to grow indoors. You can actually grow almost every plant that you grow in your garden indoors if you have the space. So I know someone that their bathroom because they just have an apartment that's inside a building, they literally do not have an outdoor window except for one in their living room. Can you imagine? I just can't. I don't know how she does it. She just amazes me that she survives in that space, just her living room window. But she grows her squash in her bathroom because for some reason it really likes it. So she has underneath her sink a 5-gallon pail. She starts her squash at the window. She takes them in there, and there's enough red and blue light coming off of a regular light bulb, if you keep it close to the plant, that it will grow. So she generally harvests 4 or 5 squash in her bathroom every season. I think it's wonderful. As for window spaces, as long as you have light, here's the key to growing plants indoors. Do not overwater them. Please don't overwater them. House plants, 4 things. They probably have like goggles and snorkels and everything because everyone gives their house plants so much water. As a general rule, they only need to be watered indoors about once a week. A house plant designed to be in the house probably only needs watered about once every 10 days. The exception to that, of course, is any kind of fern. You have to play those by ear. But the biggest reason people's plants don't survive indoors is they overwater them. If you know yourself and you know, oh my God, I need a drink, my plant must need a drink too, start watering your plants with a spray bottle. You can spray them every day. that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Then they won't get overwatered. And because what happens is their roots start to rot, and then the plant doesn't get fed, and then the plant doesn't produce. And then you're mad at the plant, and someone brings it to you and they plunk it on a table in front of you and say, "Okay, can you fix this? It's almost dead." Now you fix it back up and give it back to them. And 6 months later, they're back. "This stupid thing is dying again." I'm like, "I'm going to shut your water off." You can celery, anything that you can get that has that stump on the bottom of it, lettuce. You can grow baby cabbage leaves. You can grow anything that has a bit of that root on it. I grew up my entire life. My mom always, you buy a bag of onions and one always starts to get mushy and grow. Yeah. She would grab whatever coffee cup was chipped, put a bit of water in the bottom, plunk that onion in there so it was barely touching the water. And all winter, she would clip green onions off of it. And it was like always on the go. We always had 2 or 3 cups in the window that had green onion growing out of them. Just the greens. You only use the green tops in salads, and those were always growing. And that's what your big onions will grow, those green tops, because that's what they're going to grow in the garden anyway. So it's a great way to get extra food. Celery is a good one. Those lettuce that are in a head that have just the bottom. Now you can buy them with the root system on them. That root system will grow in more leaves. There's a ton of things. Green onion, if you cut the green onion and leave about that much of the onion and the root that hangs the little hairy bits at the bottom, and set that on the top of soil and just cover it a little bit, you'll grow another green onion. Almost everything. Carrot tops, because everybody says there's no use for a carrot top. If you like pesto, you will be so happy that I said to you, make your pesto with green carrot tops. So delicious. Just like you would use basil, only you use carrot tops. You put your garlic in there, you put your oil in there, you buzz it up, you throw in a little Parmesan cheese, and you put it on your pasta. So good. So good. Best thing you've ever tasted. So yeah, that's great. I'm happy to see someone does that. That's awesome.
Yeah, Eileen and Emily had both said that their romaine lettuce grew better in the water than in the soil.
Yes.
So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Somebody else mentioned here, I don't know, this person might have come in a little bit later. She said, when you plant the 3 sisters, are all 3 in one mound? So I'll let you just briefly summarize that, Kitty.
Yeah, so I'll go back over that real quick. Yeah, 1 mound. So your corn is in the top. If it's a small mound, 5 to 7 corn seeds. Once they've come up about 5 or 7 inches, then your bean seeds around them, still on the top of that mound. So like 5 or 7 seeds, and then around the edge, your squash. So all 3 in that mound, they're the original companion plants. They love to grow together. And I wish we would have had time to talk about that, because I have great stories about companion planting and how we experimented to see what grows together. Just so you all know, your potatoes have to be grown separately in your garden. Nobody likes to grow by them because they fart. Potatoes give off a farty gas. Nobody likes to grow by them. I always wondered why old folks, when I was younger, why their potatoes were always in a separate section. That's the potato section. I wonder how come. Well, now I know. They fart. I didn't know that, but now we know. Farty potatoes. Nobody likes to sit by them. It's like sitting by someone on the bus and you're going, whoo, 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 baby. So yeah, potatoes like to grow by themselves.
So you don't put your plants in until after either the May Day weekend.
May 2-4.
Yep, after May 2-4 weekend.
Yeah.
So I'll just say thank you so much, Kitty. Extending our sincere gratitude for all your time and knowledge and wisdom. We really, really appreciate it.
I just want to say this. It doesn't matter what you do. Every season, at least one time in the spring, summer season, grow one thing. Even if all you do is sprout a seed to put on your sandwich, grow something that will awaken a part of you that's very important. So take care of yourselves, everyone. And I'll see you later today.